Being a math teacher sounds noble until you find out what it actually cost. The pay, the rules, the students who stared at you like you were speaking a foreign language, which, if you were teaching algebra, you basically were. In movies and daydreams, the math teacher is inspiring. They stand at a blackboard covered in elegant equations, have one dramatic breakthrough moment with a struggling student, and the class bursts into quiet respect. Maybe a slow clap. Maybe a scholarship. But the real history of math teachers is not that movie. It is a very long story about people who knew things others desperately needed to know, and were paid almost nothing, controlled at almost every level, and blamed when students didn't learn, and ignored when they did. And somehow, across thousands of years, they kept showing up. The story starts earlier than you'd think. In ancient Greece, if a boy made it past age 12 and into advanced study, he could attend one of the academies set up by figures like Plato, Aristotle, or Pythagoras. These were not schools in the way we think of them. Pythagoras taught by talking to his students arranged in a semicircle, occasionally drawing in the sand to illustrate a point, the way a modern teacher might use a blackboard. No desks, no textbooks, no lesson plans submitted to anyone. Just a man drawing triangles in the dirt and explaining why numbers meant something bigger than counting. In most ancient civilizations, formal education was only available to male children with a sufficiently high status, wealth, or caste. Which means the math teacher's first problem, the one that has never fully gone away, was that most of the students who needed the knowledge most were never allowed in the room. Euclid taught in Alexandria around 300 BCE. Very little is known about his actual life, except that he taught in Egypt and wrote The Elements, a work that influenced the development of mathematics for more than 2,000 years. He is sometimes called the greatest math teacher who ever lived, and we don't even know what he looked like. That detail alone tells you something about how history has always treated the people doing the actual teaching. Then came the Middle Ages, and math got complicated. Not the math itself, but the status of the person teaching it. High society looked down on those who had careers requiring extensive mathematics knowledge. The church controlled education. All content was centered around religion, meaning that subjects like basic math were only taught when they served a religious purpose, for building, for business, or for music and services. The math teacher was not a respected philosopher. They were a practical necessity, like a plumber, but with worse job security. Fast forward to the 1800s, and you might think things had improved. They had, slightly. There were actual school buildings now. There were blackboards, which must have felt like a genuine miracle after centuries of sand. And there were rules. So many rules. Female teachers were often required to be single and forbidden to marry during their employment. Marriage was seen as a distraction from teaching duties, and a signal that a woman should shift to homemaking. A woman who fell in love could lose her job. Not because she was a bad teacher, because she was a woman who had the audacity to have a personal life. The rules went further than that. Teachers could not keep company with men. They had to be home between 8 in the evening and 6 in the morning. They could not loiter downtown in ice cream stores. They could not get into a carriage with any man except their father or brother. They could not dye their hair. They could not wear bright colors. They could not smoke. Some contracts apparently decided that a woman who visited a barber shop was already halfway to moral ruin. And for all of this, the compensation was extraordinary, in the sense that it was extraordinarily low. One contract from 1877 paid a teacher $87.50 for an entire year. In modern terms, that works out to roughly $2,000 annually. Try paying rent with $2,000 a year while also following a 10-point personal conduct code written by people who would fire you for eating ice cream in public. By the 1930s, high school teachers in large cities were earning a median of around $2,700 per year, a real improvement from the rural teachers in the 1910s, many of whom were paid just a few $100s annually plus room and board. Room and board meant living with a local family, which meant the math teacher had no privacy, no independence, and likely spent their evenings being watched by the same community that employed them. Until the end of the 19th century, teachers' salaries were tied to results, adjusted according to how many of their pupils succeeded in achieving basic standards. Performance-related pay for a teacher who had no control over how hungry her students were, whether they had slept, or whether their parents thought school was worth the trip. Get paid based on results you couldn't fully control. Sound familiar? That debate never fully ended. The classroom itself was no sanctuary. One room, multiple grades, all ages. Teachers managed multiple grades in a single room, kept fires burning during winter, and maintained attendance records by hand. Before the first student arrived, the teacher had already swept the floors, lit the stove, and hauled in enough wood to keep 30 children from freezing. The school day hadn't even started yet, and the job was already exhausting. There were no teachers' lounges, no planning periods, no laminator. You taught, you cleaned, you planned, you graded, and then you went home to your room in someone else's house and started again tomorrow. The 20th century brought some relief. Pay improved, unions formed, marriage bans were eventually lifted, at least officially. By the end of the 1950s, most schools had moved to a single salary schedule, which largely eliminated discriminatory pay practices based on gender and ethnicity. That was progress, even if it came about 50 years later than it should have. But the math teacher's fundamental problem remained unchanged. The subject itself was the enemy. Students who struggled didn't blame themselves. They blamed the teacher. Parents who didn't understand it didn't support it. Administrators who were measured on test scores pushed harder each year. And math teachers, more than almost any other kind of teacher, carried the specific weight of being held responsible for a subject most people were afraid of before they even walked through the door. Today, the average math teacher in the United States earns around $62,000 a year, before taxes, before the money spent on classroom supplies out of their own pocket, and before calculating the actual hours worked. Teachers arrive early. They stay late. They grade on weekends. They answer emails from parents at 10 o'clock at night. They spend their summers attending professional development, writing lesson plans, and worrying about September. And 60% of teachers report experiencing burnout, with over half saying they plan to leave the profession sooner than originally planned. More than half say they would not advise a young person starting out today to become a teacher. That is not a small number. That is a profession quietly telling you it is breaking from the inside. The math teacher shortage is real and growing. 82% of public schools needed to fill 2 or more teaching vacancies before the start of the 2024 to 2025 school year. Math positions are among the hardest to fill, because the people who are good at math have other options. Wall Street will pay them more. Tech companies will pay them more. Even tutoring will pay them more, with fewer rules and no one throwing a pencil at them during third period. So why does anyone do it? That question sounds rhetorical. It is not. Because people do still choose this. Every year, someone looks at the salary, the workload, the behavior issues, the standardized tests, the parent emails, and the stack of ungraded papers that follows them everywhere like a second shadow, and they choose it anyway. They do it because there is something that happens in a classroom, sometimes, that is hard to explain to anyone who hasn't seen it. A student who said they were bad at math suddenly isn't. A concept clicks. Something that looked like a wall becomes a door. And the person standing at the front of the room, who swept sand in ancient Greece, who drew triangles in the dirt, who followed 10 conduct rules and got paid $87 a year, who still buys their own dry erase markers, was the one who opened it. That moment doesn't show up in a salary survey. It doesn't show up in a burnout statistic. But it is why the job has existed, in one form or another, for at least 3,000 years. And why it will keep existing, even when everything around it makes it harder than